Okay, I think we can slowly get started as people are logging in. Let me start with welcoming everybody at this first inaugural talk of a new series that I'm going to take a few minutes explaining. Before doing that, and for the few people that do not know me, let me introduce myself. I'm Karl Macour. I'm the chair of the standing panel on impact assessment. In my day job, I'm a professor at the Paris School of Economics, a researcher at INRAE. So I'm talking here as chair of SPIA, and as SPIA is launching this new series where we don't think there is a lack of kind of virtual webinars and talks for anybody to participate to, but nevertheless, realize that maybe there is a demand or a room for a slightly different series, which is the objective will be here not to present work that is finished, that has findings, that has results, but rather to present work in work in progress, work that is either funded by SPIA or of relevance for the questions regarding impact assessment in the CGIAR more broadly. And the idea of doing this is to kind of collectively, as a community of practice and an expanding community of practice, reflect on methods, on different approaches, etc. So why do we want to do this? So for those of you who do not know SPIA's mandate, among other things, is to help document the impact of the research that the CGIAR as a system conducts. That's not an easy task because research, doesn't lend itself very easily to measuring impact. It takes a long time. It is uncertain, and in order to think of impact, of course, there is a number of things along the causal chain that need to happen for that research to lead to long-term and or large-scale impacts on the ground. Now, for those of you in the CG, and most of you are, you also know that there is more and more emphasis on kind of this type of large-scale impact. And so this is a question that clearly goes beyond SPIA towards kind of many people in the centers and their collaborators. So given that this is not an easy question, there is a lot of to answer. There is a lot of methodological issues to sort out, and in particular, I'm not going to, the point of the series in a certain way is to kind of look for present approaches and examples of projects that have gotten around some of those challenges, and I'm sure no project will have come around all of the challenges, but collectively they could help provide, some examples, some ideas for approaches that may also be relevant for other contexts. And so, a part of the challenge, of course, is related to the fact that when we think of large-scale impacts, time needs to have passed to measure that, and in particular to measure the type of outcomes we may be interested in measuring, and that the CG as a system sets itself out to affect that themselves may take a long time to materialize. So as a result, and kind of given the long-term sequence, kind of one of the key challenges and something that I think will be highlighting or that will be highlighted in a number of papers is this problem that we cannot wait for this whole period to have passed to start thinking about how we're going to measure these impacts, and thinking about starting to think about about designs that or the type of data that may be needed and that may want to be able to start setting up even before to get to those type of methods is one part of I think of the conversation to have. So SPIA is very happy to have a relatively diverse audience for this first webinar. So I wanted to take this few minutes first of all to make sure that if anybody is connected, that actually is connected because they expected to see results or findings, then I may as well tell you no, that that's not the objective, and so nobody will be offended if that's what you came for you decide not to stay. But really the objective here is to start a conversation with this expanded community, and so in that sense, we were happy to see both people we know and we've interacted with a lot about similar types of questions, and new people in this crowd to expand this conversation. So with that, I've said way more than I should have, but I hope the expectations are clear. And so I'm very excited to present the speakers of this first series, of this first talk. And so we'll have a talk by a team of 4 people. I think Karl is going to start. So Karl Hughes from ICRAF, who's teamed up with Ruth, Meinzen-Dick from IFPRI, Priyadarshini, and I hope I didn't pronounce that too horribly, from the Foundation of Ecological Security in India, and Vågen from ICRAF. Karl, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Just let me share my screen, my video. That's this data graph. Oh dear, I had practiced. Here it is. One more thing I need to do. Oh, sorry. You can see, yeah, I need to, no, it's not working.
Yes, it's working well.
What can you see in front of me? Can you see the actual front beginning screen on slideshow mode?
Yep. Yeah, it's perfect.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay, good. Okay, so what we're going to look at is there's a big initiative in India called the Promise of the Commons, and it's really about restoring common land, and Ruth and Pratiti will explain a bit more about what that is. But we're really looking at kind of the lessons learned for trying to evaluate the medium and longer term impacts of CG research-informed innovations in general, but using this as kind of a case study. So we're going to be kind of walking you through a story of our progress to date. And now my thing is not moving. Well, I'm going to have to stop presenting because my screen is not progressing. 1 second. What is going on here? I think I might have to just disconnect from this monitor and go on my laptop full on. Sorry about this.
Karl, sometimes
we did practice, but you know, when you're implementing things, it never. Okay. Are you seeing my screen now?
Yes.
Are you seeing the timeline?
Yes, and it advanced.
Yes, okay. Oh, in advanced mode.
I mean, it
advanced. Yes. Okay. Okay. So what we're going to present here is kind of it's more of a story of our progress to date and some of the methodological challenges and some inputs from SPIA came along the way. So we're going to start a little bit about the historical collaboration between some CGIAR researchers and FES, and we're going to learn a little bit about what it is we're evaluating. So we'll actually hear from FES. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the demand from FES to strengthen the monitoring, evaluation, learning, and impact assessment, the MELIA, around the whole Promise of the Commons initiative. And then we're going to talk about how we tried to seek funding to start implementing bits of this MELIA strategy for the Promise of the Commons initiative, and how that kind of led into the SPIA call for evaluating the longer term impacts or the accountability window. And then how we developed the expression of interest and the full proposal, where we'll really kind of spell out some of the methodology and the identification strategy we're using to evaluate the impacts of FES's model. And then we'll give an update on some of our experiences in implementing the whole impact assessment. And then obviously the challenges we've experienced with COVID and how we've adapted through doing a mobile survey and what are the next steps going forward. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to Ruth, who's going to walk us through the historical collaboration between FES and herself and CAPRI. Ruth?
Thank you. If you go to the... So some background. When this call for evaluation of CGIAR input, long-term involvement came out, I know most people probably thought about, oh, a new rice variety or something. And at IFPRI, we don't quite do that, but we have, I've been involved with the CGIAR system-wide program on collective action and property rights, or CAPRI, which, for those of you who don't know the acronym, it was one of the very first CGIAR system-wide things that involved all 15 centers and over 400 other partner organizations. It was convened by IFPRI, and it started in about 1997 and continued until the new CRPs started, when it kind of got folded in under PIM flagship on governance of natural resources. We had annual workshops on a whole range of topics related to property rights, collective action, and different topics. We also had very strong engagement with common property and training workshops in Kenya and then in South Asia in 2005 and 2006. That's where I got to know FES. FES, Foundation for Ecological Security, sent whole groups of their field staff to this training both years, and they were really impressive. These were people who were dealing with collective action and property rights issues in the field, although they didn't always have the language to refer to it in those terms. They would meet every evening and talk about how what they had heard in the workshop and the readings related to FES's work and how they could incorporate that into the FES field manuals. So on the next slide, what was it that resonated? At the core of CAPRI, in a sense, was this little framework that explained why collective action and property rights were important for natural resource management and for a whole bunch of other things, climate change, but at its heart, saying that if you are looking at things with a long time horizon, you need to worry about property rights or tenure security, or you won't have the incentives and authority for adoption. If you're working at things above the scale of the individual plot, you need to look at coordination, and at lower levels, that's usually collective action, but it needs to interact with the state as well. Next. A lot of that is on the commons. Everything above the level of the individual farm is some level of commons or shared resource. So we also worked with FES a lot on building attention to the commons, including FES hosting the the International Association for Study of the Commons conference, international conference, and that was just after Elinor Ostrom had won the Nobel Prize in Economics, and they arranged for us to meet with the Prime Minister of India and the Planning Commission to get commons on the agenda at the national and state levels. Next. They also collaborated with us in developing a source book that distilled a lot of the research from CAPRI into things that are accessible for mid-career people, NGOs or government, that is in accessible language with cartoons and things like that. Next. So I think from that you'll hopefully see in what Pratiti presents how the notions of collective action and property rights from Capri really have found strong roots in the work of FES. By giving them a language to connect to the research on this in their field work and in their policy level advocacy. So I'll turn it over to Pratiti now.
Thank you, Ruth. Hello, everyone. So about FES, our mission is to conserve nature and natural resources, and to do so, we believe in strengthening collective action at different levels, right from community, the village community, to the engaging with block level officials or officials, government officials at the state and national level, as well as engaging with other actors, for example, the researchers or media or think tanks. Next slide, please. So we are present in 10 eco-regions of the country. We are working mostly across environmentally vulnerable regions that face a wide array of challenges, including recurring droughts, overexploitation of water resources, mining, revenation. The communities, the local communities that we are working with, they are mostly dependent on rain-fed agriculture, and the production systems are on the edge. And these communities are mostly tribal communities, pastoral communities, as well as smallholder farmers. And there has been a strong focus on working on commons, which constitute nearly 1/6 of the total India's land mass. In the areas that we are working in, common lands such as forests, pastures, these constitute about nearly 50% of the area in which we are working, and they contribute to about 20 to 40% to the household incomes of the rural people in these locations. Next slide, please. So our core model focuses on working on the interconnected issues of secure property rights, mainly community land rights, strengthening collective action and improving access to resources and finances for restoration and action. And this helps in improving the ecological health and making rural livelihoods more resilient. So the focus that we see here, the core model, this itself, as Ruth shared, this has emerged not only from the experiences that FES has had over many years, but also from reflections and with the ongoing engagement and partnerships with external actors such as the CG group of institutions. So as Ruth shared, we have been participating in the workshops that were organized by Capri, and that really helped us in building our conceptual understanding around concepts like legal pluralism and understanding tenure as a bundle of rights. And also the evidence that was generated by Capri that has augmented in our engagements with the government since 2010, and we've been able to raise the profile of commons and expand our operations to many number of villages, thousands of villages at present. Next slide. So presently we are reaching out to 16 million people in India, and who are helping in better management of nearly 9 million acres of common land across India. Next. And these are some of the impacts that we see on the ground. So this is by working on those three aspects of core model that we shared just now. This is the kind of change that looks on the ground. And to understand what does this change actually mean in terms of data, in terms of changes in the income, in terms of changes in the biomass conditions and all, we have been undertaking several evaluation studies. Next. So the evaluation studies that we've undertaken so far, this includes, this shows that with degraded lands turning into ecological healthier lands, there is more biomass, there is more biodiversity. So as you can see, 2.6 times higher biomass and a higher carbon stock. There's improved water availability, nutrient flows improve, there is more of carbon stock, which also contributes to climate change mitigation. Next. And alongside, what we also see is that there's strong collective action which is there in these local communities. The local stewardship becomes very strong. There are thousands of women and men leaders who not only become the champions of commons, but they also become the flag bearers of other developmental issues in their area, engaging and negotiating with external actors. What we also see is more cohesive communities with more trust, confidence, sharing resources, information, which improves their capacities to adapt to adverse situations. Next, please. And with secure tenure rights, strong local governance, and better resource conditions, the impacts that we see is also on the economic condition in terms of more fodder, water, and better soil health. So we see an overall increase in 30 to 50% increase in household incomes over a period of 3 to 5 years. And there's also increase in the double cropping area because of the improved water availability, as well as increase in livestock assets in the communities because of better water and fodder availability. Next, please. But considering the scale of the problem and the nature of the problem that we're dealing with, we realized a few years back that it's not just FES that can bring the change, and just FES working on commons cannot bring a lot of change. So what is required is some kind of a systems change at a scale. So we started the Promise of Commons initiative in 2019, which envisages to ensure gender inclusive community-led governance of commons in India. And by the end of 5 years, we aim, along with the NGOs and government partners, we aim to reach help secure rights of 38 million rural people across 30 million acres of commons, and also strengthen the voice, agency, and power. And this will also help in increasing the incomes of local communities. So, and it is in this context that we started this study with support from SPIA. Next slide. So while we had been undertaking quite a few evaluation studies, and we'd also been tracking changes in vegetative cover using remote sensing techniques and monitoring groundwater recharge in some of the selected sites, we felt that there's a strong need to also strengthen the evidence base by employing robust methods for causal identification and generate some actionable learning to accelerate the whole Promise of Commons initiative. And what we also wanted to do through this study was to also understand what is it that helps in scaling, what kind of interventions can be used at scale. So as part of the study, I think as Karl will share in the later slides, this will also help in experimenting and assessing the scalability of new methods and tools, such as the collective action tool, which we would be experimenting as part of the SPIA study as well. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Pratiti. So this goes into the second kind of big event where Ruth and FES had kind of brought together a number of CG researchers on kind of another. It was a second round of how the CG researchers could help strengthen this whole Promise of the Commons initiative. And then, as Pratiti was saying, there was kind of interest on FES's side of how to strengthen the monitoring, evaluation, learning, and kind of generating more robust or rigorous evidence of impacts and potential impacts of this work. So there was this big meeting where there was kind of a subgroup that came up with this initial MELIA framework for kind of the Promise of the Commons. And as you can see here, there's kind of 4 spheres. The sphere that we're looking at here, and what we're presenting here, is really the community sphere, or the looking at the core FES model at village level or habitation level, and what kind of impacts that may have brought about. So we came up with strategies that we wanted to review all those studies that Pratiti talked about, look at the rigor and kind of do a synthesis of those studies. We haven't got there yet, but that's still something that needs to be done. And then we wanted to come up with an integrated portfolio of impact studies, both around kind of the accountability side of evidencing impact and even future impact, but also some experimenting around how to optimize FES's approach to the model so it can be more effective or more cost effective. But then there's this whole ambition, as Pratiti was saying, to scale through partners. So there's a whole component of how can we monitor and evaluate the scaling out of this whole core model and adaptations to this core model. And then FES is involved in a lot of policy work to create an enabling environment for all this to happen. What kind of policy outcome evaluation studies could be done on key things to look at impact, and how can we kind of enhance the policy impact of FES? And then there's a whole public sphere where we want to really change public perceptions and attitudes towards the commons, to make them, more exciting, more sexy. People want to invest and protect them rather than treating them as wastelands or problem areas, to appreciate the provisioning and regulatory services and other services they provide. So there's this idea of using altmetrics and media analysis and so forth. So we came up with this big kind of integrated framework. But then there was like, okay, well, we need to get funding to make this happen. So there was this, in Q1, right after the workshop, this kind of ambition to try to source money to finance the MELIA work associated with the Promise of the Commons initiative. And Ruth in particular was successful with other colleagues in applying for a Leland Fellow. And I hope she's on the call. So that was successful. So we have Isis Blanca, who's been working with FES now for over a year on strengthening the broader MELIA, but also supporting the impact study that SPIA is supporting. So that was successful. Another opportunity came from WLE. They were looking at ways of trying to strengthen monitoring, evaluation, and impact assessment around land restoration in general. So we were able to access some complementary funding to use kind of the Promise of the Commons as a case study to develop an integrated way of monitoring, evaluation, and assessing the impact of land restoration, and then working towards scaling that out in other places such as Africa. And then FES had been under discussions with some researchers from University of Boulder, Colorado. And they're very keen on how to look at what FES is doing from more of an inclusivity point of view, and looking at benefits to marginalized groups and gender issues and so forth. So they're really supporting the whole experimentation side of what we're doing in terms of optimizing, identifying ways to optimize FES's intervention approach. So then the other opportunity, of course, was SPIA's long-term accountability call. When the called request for expression of interest, I actually took a special trip to FES right after this 2018 workshop to help develop this. And one of the initial steps, of course, was to look at all what was Pratiti was describing and try to piece it together in terms of a theory of change. So I'm not going to go into describe this in detail, but it's there, and it was a big step in terms of setting up the impact assessment and the identification strategy, because we had to kind of understand how theoretically is what FES is doing on the ground expected to generate impact. The core intervention areas at the bottom here are kind of another way of describing what Pratiti was discussing about, and also what Ruth was describing. And a key takeaway message is that all these things are kind of interrelated and interact and are needed together to kind of ignite these causal pathways leading to impact. So we also at that time had to kind of agree where we're going to actually carry out the primary data collection. Pratiti showed that there's this huge scale of the initiative, and we ultimately came around 6 districts where we were going to focus the primary data collection work. And that was a lot. There's a lot of discussion and compromises on both sides on identifying these 6 districts. So FES really wanted to ensure that there was representativity of all the key areas where they've been working. We needed to make sure, there was good opportunities to find potential comparison villages that could help us with causal identification, practicality and feasibility issues. All these things played into account. But anyway, at the end, we came up with focusing on these 6 districts, which has implications for representativity, generalizability, or external validity, which I'll talk about a bit later. And then at that time, we developed this integrated mixed methods impact assessment design that was featured in the SPIA expression of interest. And everything is interrelated here. So we wanted to start with an initial quasi-experimental design where we'd look at around 72 sites where FES had been working, and then set some baseline data up for an actual phase in design going forward, where we would use that data collected from fresh sites where FES wanted to scale out to use those sites as potential comparators to areas where FES did work. So there's going to be the plan is to take advantage of the fact that we're doing this fresh baseline data on new areas where FES will be expanding into, and those areas that match, or those villages that match up well on key characteristics, we'll use them to estimate the impacts of FES's work to date. So I'll be describing this in more detail later, but I just wanted to show that this integrated framework that we came up with. And then FES, as I mentioned, had been collaborating with the University of Boulder, Colorado, and they're very keen into doing some field experiments to identify different ways to enhance inclusive participation in what FES is doing. Selecting 216 sites, 72 were to be set aside to put on a waiting list as kind of longer term controls. And then we have 144 that we can assign to different treatments and do some kind of short term field experimentation work. And then that would be complemented with doing some qualitative work, some in-depth case studies, and other qualitative work to really unpack mechanisms and try to explain what's going on with respect to the quantitative findings that is coming out. So kind of the takeaway here is that we came up with a kind of a big integrated piece, and we had that featured in the expression of interest. And also during that first meeting, we fleshed out the research connection, which Ruth has already described. So this whole linkage to the CAPRI program, we really needed to show that the linkage to CG research and make a convincing case that what FES is doing was significantly shaped by CG related research. So that we were given, cautiously given the green light to develop the full proposal for SPIA. And SPIA didn't want to handle this big beast that I presented there. They wanted to really narrow in on the initial quasi-experiment, understandably. And a key challenge here is that as we're all finding out through these longer term evaluations that are ex post that weren't set up prospectively, a key challenge is that FES rolled out its core model to non-randomly targeted habitations. I'm going to be using habitations throughout, and it's kind of like a village, but in the Indian context, sometimes you have a revenue village, and then underneath in a revenue village, you may have several habitations. A lot of the times they're kind of the same, but I'll be using habitations, but just think of it as in other contexts, it'd be like a village. So we had to really think about, okay, well, what kind of selection bias are we grappling here? It's not really participant selection bias because people weren't kind of opting in to participate in FES's program. And it wasn't through targeting individual households either, where, if it was some continuous measure, we could do something like a regression discontinuity design or something. It wasn't like that. The real bias that we're looking at is program placement bias. FES selected certain habitations that met certain targeting criteria, and went into those habitations and then started its work. So the unit of intervention is the habitation, and then common land within the habitation. And our unit of analysis is kind of threefold. We're looking at kind of the habitation and the institutions in the habitation, the common land that has been prioritized for restoration, and all the households in the habitation, so a representative sample. So we're not looking at households that kind of opted in. So because of this, the argument is that propensity score matching, or it could have been some other matching technique like coerced exact matching, but we tried that and it didn't work very well given the nature of our data. The argument here is that that's a reasonable approach for this kind of for the type of bias that we're dealing with here. So in the expression of interest, we noted that FES had, in the sub-districts where it worked, had already saturated around 40% of the habitations in those sub-districts, and had ambitions to scale out to saturate the entire sub-district or block. So to target the remaining 60 to 70% of the block. So the idea was to collect representative data from habitations that had already been targeted, and then in the scaling out areas in those same blocks, 3 times as many untreated habitations, to serve as this kind of phase-in cohort, which could be exploited for kind of to estimate the counterfactual for the FES treated areas. So the proposal in the expression of interest is that we would use propensity score matching to identify a set of untreated habitations that were similar vis-a-vis key characteristics, so agroecological. We are a bit vague here, and that's a key point. We weren't too specific on which particular variables we were going to do the matching on, and that was left for further work. So SPIA, and particularly Karen, came in and said, okay, well, that's all well and good, but does FES have any formal targeting criteria for the habitations where it's actually going to work in? And I had never really thought of it, but I was very pleasantly surprised when FES does have formal specific targeting criteria that I'll present in a second of when it decides to go and work in a particular area. And then another question that SPIA asked, well, okay, if there are these targeting criteria, is there any secondary data that could be exploited that can be used as proxies for these criteria to which to inform the matching? And that led us to kind of this 2-stage propensity score matching strategy, where in the first stage, we're using this secondary data to identify the whole cohort of 288 study villages. So that's the 72 treated villages and then the 216 phase-in villages. And then what we'll do after data collection is we'll do another round of matching where we're going to refine to one-to-one matching using the primary data that's collected from that study. So we have a kind of a whole strategy to collect kind of similar data, but more refined to habitation level and more, in some for time invariant variables, more updated and precise. But then, of course, when we're SPIA raised another concern is that, okay, we're looking at the long-term impacts of something that's going to scale, and you've kind of selected these 6 districts, and then you've done all this matching, and you've kind of whittled your way down to these 72 treated villages. That's not necessarily representative of all the areas where the model, the CG-informed model, has gone to scale. So how do we also address this issue of external validity or generalizability? So we added another component to the study, and I won't address everything, but we're going to randomly select 400 habitations that aren't part of this study, but are more representative of the areas where FES has worked, and stratify that by engagement year. And then through the help of Tor, who will be presenting shortly, in the polygons, in the common land areas that have been mapped, digitally mapped, we're going to use satellite imagery to see if the trends in the land health indicators that we're measuring through the primary impact study are kind of similar in kind of qualitatively in a similar kind of direction and magnitude and so forth, so that we can make a case that kind of we could expect similar types of impacts or results in these other areas, or if it looks completely different, maybe we can just conclude that this study is not really representative. But we'll see what comes out. So that led to the development of the full proposal. There's some other aspects in there. There's some environmental evaluation work that will be done to complement this, that we will be leading, but for simplicity and because we don't have much time, this is the kind of the crux of the whole identification strategy, is we're really relying on propensity score matching to address program placement bias, and then we're complementing that with this other component to try to address this external validity question or issue. Here is the targeting criteria that FES has. So this is kind of this section here is kind of formally documented through FES. So it has these broad criterion. They want to target areas that are ecologically fragile and degraded, and then kind of the social dimension, marginalized areas with high proportion of poor, tribal, landless, smallholder populations. Pratiti was explaining some of that. And then for each of these broad criteria, there's specific criteria. So areas with high proportion of common lands, upland areas, high levels of degradation, high incidence of drought, distressed agriculture, water scarcity, and so forth. Areas that need kind of restorative work. And then high proportion of people below the poverty line, and so forth. So we were able to, especially FES was instrumental here in helping us source census data. Their GIS team helped us get some GIS related variables to get secondary data on either direct measures of these criteria or at least proxy measures of these criteria. So this can be looked at in more detail if you're interested. A couple of things just to quickly point out. I was very excited to see this, that in the 2011 census, they had data on household assets, and we used that to construct a wealth index. But we did not match on it because it's 2011, and it's kind of, for many of the villages, it's after the baseline period, and we could be potentially watering down or convoluting the whole study if we start matching on things that could have been influenced by the FES's work. But there's something, I'm going to come back to that because it's quite interesting when we look at this table here. Many of you may be able to see it, but what we had to demonstrate in the proposal, okay, it's fine that FES has these targeting criteria, but if they weren't actually applied in practice, kind of going these great lengths to match based upon them is not going to add much value because it's just as good as just randomly picking. So we had to demonstrate that actually the villages that FES worked were actually quite different vis-a-vis these targeting indicators than other areas in general. So what this table here shows, it's from the proposal, is that treated villages are more likely to exemplify many of the targeting criteria. So key one is the scheduled tribe populations, that they're more likely to have higher proportions of people from scheduled tribes residing in them. But there's variation across all the indicators and across the different areas where FES is working. Okay, so that's understandable. But if we did some probit model and looked at predicting whether or not a household was in a new village, we get a very positive p-value. I should have done that, but I didn't do that for the full proposal. So that's the takeaway here is that FES has applied these targeting criteria significantly. It may have not been perfect, but there's been significant application of these targeting criteria in selecting areas where it's working. So that kind of gives us some grounds to now start matching on the basis of these targeting criteria. And this is just an example for one of the states. So as you can see, we did 3 rounds of matching because we wanted this 1-to-3 ratio. So one treated habitation to 3 phase-in or potential comparison habitations. So we had to do kind of the matching exercise for 3 rounds for each at district level. So you can see here that the probability of being treated by FES for the old villages is greater, but there's a significant area of common support of overlap here, which we needed in order for this to work. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to find any villages that are similar to the ones FES had targeted. And you can see here we went through round 1. We get a very good kind of matching up. We take out the matched phase-in villages from the first round. We take them out and then we rerun the matching again. And then we do that 3 times. So for each district, we get this 1-to-3 ratio. So that ensures that we have a statistical balance vis-a-vis these individual targeting criteria overall, or even their joint influence on determining whether or not they're in that FES targeted these areas. A key lesson that I learned through this is in some of the districts we had kind of smaller numbers of treated villages, and eventually I just figured out it was much easier to do the matching actually manually than relying on software like PS Match 2, because you end up dropping all these treated villages, and you can control things a little bit more doing it manually. But you have to be careful to make sure you're don't make any errors in terms of making sure the calipers are being used properly. Another issue that SPIA had, which was very legitimate, is because FES has been kind of scaling more and more, the numbers of habitations has been working as has been increasing significantly over the years, is that maybe a lot of the habitations where FES had worked had only been exposed to the core model for 5 years or for a few number of years. Our cutoff was at least 5 years, but you could have had a situation where most of them had just been exposed to 5 years, and we're trying to get at the longer term impacts. So what this graph just shows is that half of the treated habitations have had at least 10 years of exposure to FES's core model. Some of them more recent and some of them a lot greater. We can see how we can do some exploratory analysis to try to look at, does duration of exposure really matter for impact? But of course, that's not randomly assigned, so there'll be more exploratory analysis. Just a couple of words on the outcomes, because the outcome measurement and what we're trying to measure. So it does all go back ultimately to that theory of change I presented earlier. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but our key kind of socioeconomic measure is we want to try to see to what extent are households actually benefiting from the restoration of commons. So the theory would be that they restore commons, and then they can the productivity of these common land resources is kind of revitalized, and people can get more products and services from these areas. So we have this commons livelihood framework, and just very simply, it just has these 3, the diversity of products, the contribution of these products are making to meeting needs for fuel wood, fodder, and so forth. Whether or not these products are resulting in any labor savings or monetary savings. So if they collect fuel wood from the commons, does that mean they don't have to go out and buy it? Or if they collect fodder from the commons, they don't have to go buy it, or they don't have to go as far to get it because it's in the nearby restored common land. And then we also are looking at kind of intra-household equity issues. Are both men and women benefiting? Are women benefiting in terms of either monetary or labor savings? And if these products are actually being sold, do women have some control of the resulting income? So we have these dimensions, and it's basically an index, but this is what we put in the proposals as our main, one of our main socioeconomic outcome variables. We also look at the monetary value of all the products that were accessed. We're going to measure consumption expenditure, kind of higher level measures. We're going to construct, capture data on household assets, both for the current phase and for households that have been around for quite some time. We're going to recall these so we can reconstruct baseline data on household asset ownership, so we can check to see whether or not there were differences at baseline in terms of household wealth status, and then also see if in the FES areas household wealth has improved greater over time, kind of a difference in diff. There's something I'm going to talk about more is the Coping Strategies Index is kind of our measure of resilience, but I'm going to come back to that when we talk about our mobile survey that we've done. And for food security, just a kind of a short and simple, because it's short and simple and it seems quite plausible to capture quality data. The minimum dietary diversity for women index, which is based on kind of food consumed during the previous day. And then we want to look at attitudes to commons and exposure and participation in commons restoration activities. So that's kind of at the household and individual level. And then we've developed this index called the Commons Restoration Action Index, and it's really to look at habitation level to see to the extent to which kind of what's in theory supposed to happen kind of at habitation level in terms of FES's core model is actually materialized. So we have these 3 dimensions: rights, institution, and action, and under each dimension we have kind of indicators that show kind of a progression vis-a-vis that dimension. So the higher the score on the index, the more progressed kind of the rollout of this rights claiming and institutional strengthening and action around commons is. So that's what we're doing there. Now we have a big component led by Tor Vågen and Liwa Nowicki and with key scientists at FES as well, Hamani and others. And I'm going to hand it over to Tor now to talk about what we're doing in terms of the biophysical measurement. Tor?
Yeah, thanks, Karl. So basically, I'm just going to give you a quick run through and a few highlights on the biophysical measurements, and this relates more to the assessments of ecological health that Pratiti mentioned earlier. Which of course has big implications in terms of resilient livelihoods in these common lands. So for this part of the project, we have built on the Land Degradation Surveillance Framework, or the LDSF, which is a systematic way to assess soil and ecosystem health across landscapes. Next slide, please. So by building on this, we basically have a global network of sites in about 45 countries now. So there's a large data set that we can build on in terms of the indicators. But because of the design of this project, or for the purpose of this project, we basically modified the actual sampling design and used the randomized sampling of the demarcated common lands, and as well as spillover areas. So areas next to the common lands, in order to be able to look at those as well. And then we added additional plots for vegetation surveys, which is for the purpose of looking at biomass, but also biodiversity. Some of the key indicators, I'm not going to list them all. There's a lot of different indicators that go into the LDSF, but some of the key indicators surveyed or measured include land degradation, so it's things like soil erosion and compaction or root depth restrictions. We look at things like land use, ownership, a lot of other things related to land use. Shrub and tree distribution and biodiversity, soil organic carbon, soil pH, soil fertility, and soil water infiltration capacity. So for the soil mapping and so on, this is, of course, this work is still ongoing, and there's been a huge sampling campaign that's still ongoing, and samples are on their way to Nairobi at the moment for analysis. Next slide, please. So these are just some photos from and maps from Himani on just showing some of the village meetings and the resource mapping that's being done. And as well as some of the boundaries, including the spillover area generation and the random points there in the lower right, just an illustration of the random points generated in the common land, so at the top, outlined in green, and in the spillover area at the bottom, outlined in yellow. Next, please, Saz. And just some highlights from the field again in terms of some of the engagement that goes into this with the farmers, and the soil sampling, the measurements of the vegetation. And you see in the lower left corner there, infiltration measurements. We use relatively simple methods for these things, but what we do is we repeat these measurements across these landscapes to try to get to a better understanding of variability. And here you can also see the soil sampling in the lower right, where the team in the field is after having sampled the soils, are labeling and packing these so that they can be shipped and processed. And then we run the analysis on them here in Nairobi, so that we have, for the lab analysis, we have a consistent set of analysis that is used across all LDSF-related work globally. Next slide, please. So this is just some examples of some of the outputs from the analysis. This is work that's being done by IDA, and basically looking at infiltration measurements across old and new villages, for example, but also for the different blocks in the study, etc. So as you can see here from these graphs, I'm not going to go into this in much detail, but there's a lot of variability within these landscapes. And one key aspect of this work is, of course, to understand that variability and to also understand the effects of the establishment, the types of treatments that are going into the common lands, and how that impacts soil infiltration capacity, which is a key indicator of soil health. Next slide, please. And here is just one example on looking at land health, and in this case, soil erosion prevalence. So what we do is that once we have the data from the field, including also the soil samples, we use these data to develop models to predict these indicators spatially using remote sensing data. So basically, this relies on the use of machine learning techniques to take the field data and then create these types of predictive surfaces that you see on the right. So the map you see on the right there is basically soil erosion prevalence, and areas where we predict low erosion are in black and gray, and areas where you see red and especially the yellow are areas that can be considered hotspots where we predict high prevalence of erosion. And so this is done, in this case, this is at 30-meter resolution on the ground. So as you can see, on the map on the left there is just shows a satellite image for the same area where we have that erosion map. And you could, just to give you a sense, the satellite image is from December 2020. It just gives you a sense of the spatial resolution of these maps. And as you can see, they're quite detailed. And as Karl mentioned, once we have these maps, and we produce these for many of the indicators, including soil carbon, etc., and other soil properties, we can overlay the polygons onto these maps, and then we can extract these indicator values from the map and look at that in relation to the data sets and the analysis that Karl just talked about. Next slide, please. And my final slide today is just to give you a small flavor of the tree diversity that we're seeing in one of the areas in Bhilwara in Rajasthan, and some of the sampled villages there. So the colors on the bars there represent different villages, and we can see there's obviously a lot of variation between villages in terms of what species are most dominant. But I have on the left there species like Acacia nilotica, and certain invasive species such as Prosopis juliflora, which is the third most common in this particular area. So it's really important, of course, to understand what types of species are dominant, and also to understand, especially in terms of invasive species and the prevalence of invasive species and how that relates to soil health and to ecosystem health in general. But also, we'll also be looking at diversity and a lot of other metrics around biodiversity using these data from the tree and shrub surveys. So thank you, Karl, back to you.
Fantastic, great. So now I'm just going to conclude by talking a little bit about initial implementation in our COVID mobile survey. So with the villages selected for the 288 from the first stage of the propensity score matching, we were off to a good start. So the ecological data got under quite well. This was actually before the proposal was approved. There was, with Tor and his team, there was a sharing event with FES staff and kind of agreeing on protocols for the ecological data collection. That's just a photo of that work. But what was very interesting is that we did all this matching based on the secondary data. But of course, there's always a gap between what the census data says and what's actually there on the ground. So in some villages, in some habitations where the teams went to map out the common land, they actually found that there was no common land in those areas. It had actually been encroached upon. So it wasn't even suitable to be targeted by FES in the future. So there had to be a few replacement sampling and when it was more significant, we had to revisit the propensity score matching again with some replacement villages and kind of rerun it again. In other cases, it was just kind of, if it was one or two, they had to be replaced just off the cuff because data collection was already happening and teams were already in the field. So there was some things didn't work out perfectly, which is kind of normal for any kind of study anyway. We spent a lot of time developing the survey tools. So we have a household questionnaire, some village level survey, some focus group checklists for men and women, and we had to translate these into 4 different languages because of the diversity of all the districts that we're working in. We recruited a survey firm. This picture is just showing some of the piloting work that we did. There's Pratiti and Shreya are there. And then COVID-19 hit and kind of derailed everything. Fortunately, we're still able, the ecological data collection teams had already been trained and started their work, and it was kind of a decentralized structure. So that data collection was still able to happen. But in terms of the socio-economic surveys and village level surveys and focus group discussions, we really had to put that all on hold. So that's when we kind of were like, okay, well, what are we going to do? Maybe this big COVID-19 presents an opportunity to look at whether or not FES's work has actually contributed to greater resilience. This is a large, massive covariate shock hitting both intervention areas and new potential comparison areas. Can we, given that we have household lists already had been compiled as part of the ecological polygon mapping exercise, can we take advantage of those, get phone numbers of those, or randomly sample from those lists and access phone numbers for those sampled households and actually do some kind of mobile survey? So that's what we did in the interim. We had to redo the matching again because the set of villages was slightly different for reasons I explained before. Some of the villages had to be replaced. Some villages had not had household listing done. And so we have kind of a different, slightly different cohort of villages that necessitated that we had to redo the matching. But this is just another graph showing that before and after, that we were able to line things up quite well, but at the expense, we had to drop 8 treated villages in the 4 districts where we did this work. So that's 16 villages overall. So not ideal, but we are still able to pull things off. And this is just to show, as you all know, when we either do a randomized control trial or we do even a quasi-experimental trial, we want to see how well balanced are our key covariate variables in the data. This is just showing that things are pretty well balanced out. There are no statistically significant differences. There's some in the literature now, people are shunning just looking at p-values, so they're advocating for looking at standardized differences. Some people say 0.1 or 0.2. So we have one kind of, whether or not the household is Hindu or not is kind of a significant difference if you look at the standardized difference here. And when we look at the data in one of the sites, we have one village where it's an older village that's already been treated, and it's everyone is a Muslim in that village, or all households are Muslim in that village, so it kind of skewed this thing. However, when we look at the joint significance of all these variables in terms of predicting whether or not it is an old village, is not statistically significant. So that this joint orthogonality test is non-significant. So we can conclude that for the mobile survey, it's kind of a pre-test for the bigger study. We have pretty good balance and pretty good comparability, at least overall. And just a couple of quick slides. One of the key take-home messages is COVID-19. We have evidence that COVID-19 was indeed impacting both treated and untreated habitations very significantly, both in terms of farm and off-farm activities and other income sources. This is just to look at the impacts in terms of on farm-related challenges for both matched new villages and old villages. Since the start of 2020, has your household experienced any of the following farm-related challenges? So many households are reporting in terms of trying to get access to inputs for farming, actually doing the farming activities themselves, or selling because they can't get hold of labor to actually do the farming. Selling produce is another issue. We randomly selected whether or not it'd be a male or a female that would respond to the survey, because we wanted to see if there was any gender differentiated answers, and this shows that generally the trends are quite similar. And then when we look at kind of disaggregating to district, we actually see that the two districts in Rajasthan were actually seem to have been more impacted by COVID than the ones, the two districts in the south that we looked at, which is quite interesting. But you know, over around 75% experienced at least one of these challenges as a result of COVID. So that's quite interesting. Then we look at the off-farm. What stands out here is a lot of these households are very dependent on wage labor, and wage labor opportunities were understandably a lot scarcer during these days of COVID. Again, if you look at the two districts in the south, kind of less impacted, and we see significantly more impacts in the two districts in Rajasthan. And in terms of this experiencing job loss, many households in Bhilwara reported, half that one or more people in their family experienced some kind of actual job loss. So quite significant impacts. So the whole question is, has FES's work contributed to greater resilience? We have some reasons to think why it could. Maybe the institutional strengthening work and linking to government programs around restoration of the commons, but also spilling over to different things, or actually restoring the commons itself, making different resources available that could be relied on in times of stress. So our main outcome indicator that we're looking at here is a livelihoods coping strategy index. And this is kind of a set of variables of action that was taken by the household that can be considered as maladaptive, like selling your assets or having to cut your expenses or having to migrate because there's no livelihood opportunities, or having to withdraw your children from school. Things that are not positive coping strategies, but they're actually considered to be negative and making it very difficult to recover from the shock, because you're starting to eat into some key things that are necessary for you to progress forward. So there's a whole other slide deck on this, but this is just to show a flavor of the results. One key message from this slide, this is just density plots for this indicator. There's huge variation across households is a key observation. We can see here that, again, consistent with what I was reporting before, that households in general reported to be less impacted in the two districts in the south and much greater impacted in the two districts in Rajasthan. And then we see, the curves is very slightly, but we see that the distributions for the old villages are more to the left, and the newer villages or the phase-in villages more to the right, indicating some kind of difference here. And then we look at comparing the medians here, we can see median differences graphically, except for all districts except Chittor, but the average difference here is significant. So if we want to look at this more in terms of the classic econometric models comparing averages, Overall, we see on this main measure, our weighted livelihood coping strategy index, households in new villages, so the control villages, in other words, had a 14 higher score on the index. So it was about a 5%, just under a 5% percentage point difference. So it's a very modest treatment effect, but it's kind of consistent, and it's kind of robust. So if we look at using OLS with no covariates, with covariates, looking at using robust regression, or even comparing the medians through quantile regressions, we see significant differences. And then if we use different measures of our outcome variable, if we just do a crude unweighted index of just raw binary measures of the coping strategies, so difference for OLS is significant to the 10%, but it becomes greater with these other techniques. And if we use propensity score match, principal component analysis on these variables, we again get a significant difference. And then we see kind of the same trend across the 4 districts. So it's kind of interesting. The challenge we have is that the data do not support our hypothesized mechanisms. We have these 2 candidate hypothesized mechanisms of why FES's work may have built resilience, but the variability in the data is not consistent with these hypotheses. So we're a little bit stuck here, but we thought this is just still worth sharing, and it's quite significant where we got so far. So just to conclude, before we have some time for discussion and questions, we need to now that kind of we need to slowly, now that the monsoons are finished and some of the adaptations to this new COVID reality have happened, we can finalize the common land mapping in hopefully most of the villages and resume ecological data collection. As Tor mentioned, the soil samples, the first batch is in the process of being exported to Nairobi for analysis, and that will be followed by a second batch. Unfortunately, we had problems with the leadership changes in the socio-economic data collection firm we hired, and we have to go and re-recruit another firm. And lessons from the mobile survey is we just have to be really intensive and rigorous about monitoring data quality. Some enumerators are very good and very reliable and trustworthy. Others, there's all these kind of shortcuts that are being taken, and we had audio audits and all these things to try to mitigate that, but it was very involving to check all that. And then we also need to tweak the socioeconomic data collection instruments we developed so they're fit for purpose for this new kind of context that we're working in. And we want to be able to further explore and test this hypothesized mechanism for why we may have greater resilience in the FES treated villages. For example, maybe there's something to do with enhanced reciprocity, as Pratiti was mentioning, which we didn't test for. And again, intensive monitoring of the data collection, and then we'll hopefully, well, we will by the end of the year, if all, if something drastic happens, we'll have at least did all the analysis and presented a working paper as part of our deliverables to SPIA. Okay, thank you. I'll hand it over to Mina. Are you going to do the moderation?
Yeah, I will. Thank you very much, Karl and team. That was really an excellent presentation. And I guess it's just now up to the audience to ask questions. As Karen mentioned, the whole idea was to set out the design and to sort of come to terms with the fact that this is a challenging task, and how you sort of break this up into bite-sized pieces and deal with each as they come along. Of course, COVID, nobody had anticipated. But before I say anything, maybe I should just ask, the audience here to just unmute themselves and perhaps pose your questions or comments to the team.
Have a hand from Srini.
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much. I mean, it was my name is Srini. I work at SIP International Potato Center based at Nairobi. I mean, I worked a little bit in India as well, so just trying to get some more inputs from your presentation. Sorry, it's a good presentation. I have 3 comments. and suggestions. The first one regarding the social groups that you have SEST, I suggest a team please keep that SEST separate. I see in the results you have combined both SE and ST. It has a big difference in the villages, particularly when you are working with SEST people. And the second thing, regarding the commons land resource, I'm not sure whether you really looked at the local the land revenue authorities, where they also store records. I mean, often this changes quite a lot. Recent government made a lot of changes on the land reforms. So that's something that probably after looking at your scientific data set is something that we might have to look at those records as well. The third one regarding the mobile survey, I mean, we also had the similar challenge. I got to know from other team members and other studies. But what I've realized in the study regions, especially in a village, they used to have one person called pilot enumerator. During the COVID time, obviously we can't have a kind of, you can't join hands together, or you can't have a crowd, but you can send one enumerator as a pilot enumerator in each village. You can nominate one person, and just to make sure that while they were making call, they do get appropriate informations. Often, I mean, especially people who lives in particularly the social group SEST, when they live in remote areas, the connectivity of these mobile services is pretty bad. When you have someone representative from the village who can be trained, probably that could be the better choice. So to cross check, to validate your data set before it gets into the system. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Other comments or suggestions?
Kyle, go ahead.
Kyle, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kyle. I'm a panel member at SPIA. Thanks for the presentation. Really fantastic. I just had a quick thought about whether you have any potential to kind of combine the matching that you're doing with the fact that it looks like there was kind of a staggered rollout of this program, and kind of do both a PSM like you're already doing combined with a diff and diff, especially for some of the remotely sensed outcomes that you might be able to get well prior to when these interventions took place.
So
yeah,
actually,
good
if I could build on that, had somewhat of a similar suggestion, so maybe you could just address. I also felt that this whole idea of stratifying by the year of engagement was in fact a key element of establishing impact at scale over a long time period. So I wondered if you'd like to just elaborate on that a bit, because for that you have satellite records going back, and to perhaps discuss that a little bit more than perhaps you did in your presentation.
Good. Should we start there, or?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Or do you want, to take a few more? Sorry, did you want to collect a few questions? Is that what you prefer to do?
What do you think, Ruth? I think getting overwhelmed with too many questions, maybe we start now. Okay, she's nodding her head. She's on mute.
Might
but she's
be
nodding.
good to take those without taking too long on answering them. So
yeah. No, I mean, we're capturing data on all the, to answer Srini's question, all the main categories. Kind of in terms of FES's targeting criteria, it's either scheduled class or scheduled tribe, and that's why it's kind of lumped together. But I agree that for kind of further analysis, we can't treat those two groups as homogeneous. So that's point well taken. Kind of the land revenue authorities, Pratiti, do you have any comment on what he said about looking at some of the data and the work that they're doing that we could potentially extract, at least maybe triangulate or get complementary data on some of the things we're looking at?
Yeah, so you're right that there's a lot of difference between what is there on the record and what is there actually on the ground. And we did find this even when we were doing the common land mapping exercise that Tor was talking about. So, but mostly what we've done is we've taken the de facto definition of commons to understand and to map the common lands.
Okay, and then just, can you, I mean, I think Srini made a very good point on having this pilot enumerator or someone in the new village that can follow up on things, but, and so that point is well taken, but maybe you can just highlight the innovation or the learning that you came to, because when these junior enumerators were calling these people cold, there wasn't always a positive response, and then what adaptation did we make to address that?
Yeah, sure. So what we were doing was, so we found that actually, there's a lot of survey fatigue amongst the communities right now. That's what it seemed, because many NGOs and even the government has been doing mobile surveys. So some of them were even using abusive languages. So what we did was we thought it would be very important that they understand what is the purpose of the survey. So a senior member from the FES team used to call up the respondent beforehand and ask for the respondent's time and tell him or her that this would be the time and this person will be calling you, please cooperate, and would you be willing to cooperate or not, and telling the exact purpose of the survey. And that really helped a lot. Yeah,
so it's a bit different than Srini's recommendation, which is well taken, but it was an innovation that came out to make this practical. And I didn't talk too much, but I mean that the mobile survey in the tribal areas didn't work at all. Like people, Pratiti and everyone can explain more, but people would not respond. They would be very hostile and aggressive. They didn't want to give their time. I guess there's just huge trust issues. There's the network connectivity issues was another thing that Srini had mentioned. So actually, the mobile survey data did not work in the two districts in Disha. So that was a very interesting learning.
Sorry,
so, go ahead.
Yeah, that was the point. I like to highlight. Especially you talked about in tribal area, the mobile network did not work, and there's a trust issue. And what I've learned from others, when they had this pilot enumerators, they actually have, honestly speaking, if you have someone from in that community and known to that community, you create a kind of trust, you interact with them very closely, and you build a kind of, how do you call the kind of relationship in order to get a more appropriate data set. So it's now, it's just picking up during this COVID time, but I see it is more effective. And I'm also currently right now, and I'm in the field, so I can see the kind of challenges that they have, and especially in a tribal areas, like when you are interacting with the tribals, and during this COVID time, they have a different opinion altogether what their government is doing and what they were thinking about COVID and how you approach them during this period.
Good point. I mean, Pratiti or anyone from FES, do you want to say anything? I mean, it wasn't like we had total outsiders go in there, but even despite all efforts, maybe Pratiti, anything you want to say?
Yeah, so actually the challenge was that many of these villages are new villages where we did the survey wherein FES has not intervened yet. So that kind of relationship building, rapport building has not been done yet. There's been only say like 3-4 days of engagement, and that too, it's more like interaction with the trees that happens during the ecological assessments than with the people. So yeah, so we could not get that chance, but definitely what we tried doing was we engaged the people from within those say the nearby villages, not within the village but nearby areas, so that at least the language barrier is not there. And say asking a female enumerator to talk to a female respondent rather than a man calling a female respondent.
Yeah. Okay. So now I want to just quickly touch on Karl and Mina's point and go into a bit more depth. So as I mentioned before, I mean, we did all this matching and we're kind of wheeling down to these villages, and we want to kind of look at the impact at scale and as through kind of tourist methods, we could do that. There's ways we could actually do that specifically for particular land health indicators. So we do want to kind of sample by kind of lump the years of engagement into different bins and then do the analysis and do kind of diff and look at how land trends have changed over time. But what I want Tor to kind of educate us or explain to us is that when you have kind of different series of satellite imagery, some of the challenges and complexities that implies. Yes, you can go far back, but then there's all these trade-offs because you have different kind of satellite imagery data sets. Tor, do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's absolutely true that for a lot of things, a lot of indicators, we can go quite far back in time, like say back to the early 80s or even 70s in some cases. But it really depends a lot on what indicators we're talking about. And so there's a lot of ongoing work that we are doing at the moment in terms of working across different types of satellite platforms to allow us to run models that we develop using data collected in the last 15 years on older platforms as well. So it has some challenges because there are, if you look at the Landsat program, for example, the sensors are reasonably similar, at least if you look at TM, ETM, and Landsat 8, but there are differences spectrally, and so there are some challenges there. But if we crack that, then obviously we could expand sort of that historical record in terms of predictions for things like carbon and so on as well. But for other things like vegetation cover, looking at land cover trends and so on, then it's much less complicated. So that for those types of indicators, it's absolutely possible to reconstruct these back in time.
Okay, great. Yeah, so the plan is to go back to the early 2000s and kind of look at a bigger sample of FESs, because FES already has an agenda to look at all the areas it's working and wants to expand into and kind of map the common land in those areas digitally. So we want to piggyback on that and do this type of analysis. But Kyle, if you want to have a follow-up conversation or provide some guidance and insights on this, that would be really worthwhile.
Sure, I'm happy to do that.
Okay,
feel free to reach out.
Great.
Yeah. Other questions or comments? Please, I know we're running short on time, but it would be really nice, if others had some takeaways or some comments on what we heard today.
Charles has raised her hand.
Yes.
Go ahead.
And yes, thank you. Thank you for this great presentation, and to all the presenters. That's a very interesting work, and yes, I mean that's great to see the different components that you are combining to have this impact evaluation design, how you select the outcome, etc., and how all this fits into yes, an entire framework. My question is a bit different than what we are talking about here, which is really about the design, and it's more related of the SPIA mandate. And well, I understand that you had a long-term partnership in relation with FES, but I also still wonder how in a sense you made your case to link your research. I see your smile. To link your research work into the impact evaluation, which is an impact evaluation of the FES program. So how you relate that to the CG research impact?
Ruth, do you want to kind of stress some key points, or?
Sure, but it would perhaps be also, I would like to make sure that Pratiti and other colleagues at FES can confirm this, in the sense that I think we contributed a lot to this emphasis, to helping FES to really articulate and go for emphasizing commons and ideas of collective action, how to strengthen local governance, and the importance of securing tenure rights over the commons. Those were things that have become their core model. When we first met with them, they had, I think they were still at 3,000 villages, so, you know, not a small organization. But in our partnership, we've helped them to raise resources to implement this model. So, but I think Jagdish and others from FES management would be on here, except that they're going for a major webinar tomorrow to raise another $12 million to enhance their systems change. So they're prioritizing that. Pratiti?
Yeah, definitely. So, yeah, I think we started off in somewhere around 1986 as an organization, not knowing much about land and the complexities that revolve around land issues. And it was quite a new area for us. But over the years, these engagements have been very helpful with IFPRI and with other CG institutes. So just like Ruth shared in the beginning, a lot of senior members from our team had participated in the KPRI workshop, which was organized in India, and then later, I think 2 years later, again we'd been involved, and then there was the source book preparation also. So the KPRI source book that is there, I think everybody in FES was joined after 2009. That is one source book that all of us go through. We know what's in there. So understanding property rights, understanding what is legal pluralism, understanding collective action, it has helped us in improving our knowledge and understanding around those kind of complex issues and connecting it back to the field. Secondly, the other way it has helped is, so we, as Ruth shared in the beginning, we also organized the ISC, the Conference on Commons in 2011. And that also helped in ramping up our engagements with a lot of other think tanks and also policymakers. So the evidences that were being built by KPRI and with the help of CG institutions, those evidences have really helped us in engaging with policymakers and with other donors and funders to get more, secure more investments for improving the status of commons in India. So I hope that answers.
No, I mean, it's a really good question, because it goes back to this whole research to impact pathway issue, that it's never like clear, sharp and crystal clear, that the connections between research, and it's always messy and fuzzy, and so I mean, I like the question. I take the question. I mean, we've made the case that there's significant contribution, whether or not, you know, it's 20% or 80%. I mean, it'd be very hard to kind of quantify how much FES's work has been shaped by this collaboration. But I think it's a more kind of interesting kind of theoretical question on, you know, how much research influence is needed for, you know, and how do you evaluate the impact of research? I find it fascinating, because we have to think about that all the time in these research to impact pathways.
Okay, any final thoughts or comments? If not,
no, I mean,
then...
Yeah, just to say that, I mean, you know, we really appreciate, I mean, I'm not just saying this because you give us money, but I mean, the inputs that SPIA has given us for this study and you know, very kind of well thought through constructive feedback has really been valuable. So maybe even the technical input that's been provided is even more valuable than the modest resources you've given us for this project. So really, I think that the model of SPIA going forward is to keep on providing us getting involved in reviewing what we're doing and providing constructive feedback at strategic times without micromanaging is very much appreciated.
Thank you, Karl. So I guess I'll just say a few things to wrap up. First and foremost, to thank all four of you, Karl, Ruth, Pratiti, and Tor, for actually doing exactly what I was hoping you would do and actually exceeding my expectations. So I'm really pleased. I should also add, for many people in the audience, I didn't actually bother to introduce myself. My name is Meenakshi. I'm based at Delhi University, but for the last several years, I've also had the privilege of serving as a member of SPIA, although that will come to an end, alas, in a couple of months. And in that capacity, I also had the privilege of shepherding this call for long-term, large-scale impact. And I was particularly pleased that we were able to sort of start this webinar series with an example, which is not crop improvement, although even with crop improvement, you could argue this question of attributable impact to a particular CG center versus the national partners will always be there. And the best we can do is to provide a plausible case for significant contributions. I was very happy to actually be able to expand the scope of looking at CG contributions in areas other than crop improvement, and also to give you a heads up, although I suspect many of you in the audience already know that, the idea from SPIA's point of view is not just to look backwards and try and build up a case for establishing either long-term or large-scale or both impact, but also to try and engage with the CG partners to be forward-looking, so that if we know that there's something that's going to go to scale quite quickly, to try and build in a mechanism by which we have precisely information on targeting criteria, precisely information on where things are getting rolled out and when and at what scale, so that 4, 5, 6, 10 years from now, these teams can also put together a proposal to establish, in fact, what impact has happened along the impact pathway and have a basis for being able to do that. So SPIA's mandate is not just to support the best that we can, what's happened in the past, but also to try and be a little more forward-looking and use these webinars as a means of achieving precisely that. So I can't think of a better way to have started off this webinar series. I also want to just mention that our hope is that these will be every month, and we're right now targeting the third Wednesday of every month. Given that these are webinars and given that people are across time zones, I think Ruth has been up since 6 in the morning or came on board at 6 in the morning. So we may sort of adjust the timing, but this is also a heads up to say every third Wednesday of the month. Ricardo, correct me if I'm wrong. I think we've targeted every third Wednesday of the month to actually have these webinar series. Right now, we're sort of reaching out to people to say, would you be willing to present? But if you yourself feel you'd like to use this this format and this audience to present, again, not completed work, but actually work in progress, then please do reach out to Ricardo. I think we'll also probably have a little smattering of work that is done by other people outside of SPIA to have a comparison of how similar approaches or different approaches may help us answer the questions. But anyway, coming back to this presentation in terms of an example of how you use different kinds of data sources, different scales of analysis, spatially and temporally, and also a plethora of expertise in the team. This was really the best way we could start that off. So thank you all for doing this. And thank you all for giving us time, because I know for every Ruth that has got up at 6, I know there are people for whom it's pretty late at night. So thank you again, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, depending on where you are.
Okay, thanks, Meena, and everyone. It was our pleasure. Take care.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Great.
Bye now. Bye.
Bye.
Well done, guys. Thanks.